Hello, friends, and welcome back to the While We're Waiting Hope After Child Loss podcast. I'm Jill Sullivan, your host and one of the co-founders of the While We're Waiting ministry. This is a podcast of stories of devastating loss and grief and heartbreak and struggle, and stories of hope and healing and faith, and yes, even joy. Underlying every conversation is the hope we have in Jesus Christ, which makes it possible to not just survive the loss of a child, but to live well while we're waiting to see them again in heaven one day. You can learn more about our ministry and the free bereaved parent retreats we host by visiting our website at www.whilewe'rewaiting.org. Welcome to episode number 191. I'm excited today to introduce you to my friend, Julie Thomas. Julie is married to Marcus and has a degree in secondary education from Baylor University. She has served for over 25 years at Real Options, a pregnancy clinic in Allen, Texas. Her passion is equipping volunteers to talk with women dealing with an unplanned pregnancy. She also produces an outstanding blog titled Can't Change That, which I'll link in today's show notes. In the year 2000, Julie's son David Michael was stillborn, giving her a unique understanding of the suffering and agony that post-abortive moms often feel after the death of their babies. Then in 2017, Julie experienced another devastating loss when her 16-year-old son Bryan died participating in an activity known as the choking game. According to a 2018 article in Time magazine, 82 American children between the ages of 6 and 19 died after playing the choking game between the mid-90s and the mid-2000s. Most of those were boys between the ages of 11 and 16, according to a 2008 CDC report. Julie joins me to share the stories of David and Bryan, and I am pleased to give you the opportunity to meet her today. Hi, Julie. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Hi, Jill.
I've been looking forward to having you on. I always enjoy visiting with you, and I am anxious for people to be able to meet you and have the opportunity to hear your story. So let's get started just by giving you an opportunity to share a little bit about yourself with the listeners. Tell us where you're from and what life is like for you there.
Sure. Well, I am from Garland, Texas. I am a native Texan, and I have been in the Dallas area a majority of my life. I'm married in 1992 to an Aggie, and we met in Bryan, Texas, and we named our son Bryan because we met in Bryan, Texas.
Yeah.
My husband's a mechanical engineer. I have two grown daughters that live out of the area, so I don't get to see them as much as I want to. I work for a pregnancy clinic in Allen, Texas called Real Options and have for 30 years. I love to go for a walk with friends, have coffee, hear people's stories and what God's doing in their life. I'm pretty involved with women's Bible study and a variety of other things at church. So I have one of my daughters is married and hoping to have a child, and the other one works full-time for a Christian camp.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, we're here today mostly to talk about Bryan, but Bryan is your rainbow baby, right? You have another son. Talk to us just a little bit about David.
Yeah. In 2000, my husband and I were pregnant with our third and what we assumed would be our final child.
Yeah.
I was actually headed to the doctor for a 20-week appointment. We never found out what we were having until the baby was born. We liked the surprise of, ta-da! So I was actually getting ready to leave town to go to a pregnancy conference in Colorado Springs and stopped in. The doctor was going to do a quick Doppler and hear the baby's heartbeat and just check me out. And when they went to go do the sonogram, things didn't work quite so smoothly. They were having trouble finding the heartbeat. They said, well, maybe it's your size, and so let's do a sonogram. And unfortunately, the sonogram told us two things. One, it told us that we were having a boy, and that was what we had longed to have because we had two girls already. And it told us that the baby didn't have a heartbeat. It was, as you imagine, pretty devastating. Our girls were 18 months and 2.5 at the time. We had to wait a couple of days to be able to deliver David Michael. It seemed to me to be a real cruel thing at the time that you went to the hospital to deliver a dead baby. And I wrestled with that quite a bit. Wrestled would probably be, I ignored it. I really shut down. I blocked people out of my life. My husband was my ID, caller ID. And people would call to say, hey, I heard what's going on. And he would say, she's just not up to talking to people.
Yeah. Yeah.
I remember going into the hospital and to deliver, and I wouldn't let anybody come because I was just thought, I can't do this. The hospital themselves were wonderful about walking us through what was going on. My doctor was pretty aware that we were overwhelmed, and the prospect actually of having not only deliver, but have a funeral for our child was so overwhelming that my doctor listed me at 19 and a half weeks. So I didn't have to make that choice if I didn't want to. We could do, in Texas, you can do a group burial. And so I pretty much ignored the feelings that I had. It was hard to imagine going back to work at a pregnancy clinic where people were struggling to make a decision what to do with their pregnancy when I desperately wanted mine. But after a while, I was able to go back to work, and kind of like somebody going through any traumatic event, I shut it out and ignored it. They said, don't try to get pregnant right away. You can't replace the baby you lost, but that was my goal.
Sure.
Was to get pregnant. So by the end of the year, 9 months later, I had gotten pregnant and was excited. But there was this thing in the back of my head that said, this is going to go bad.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I didn't realize you were already working at the pregnancy clinic when that happened, because I was thinking maybe that's why you have such a passion for life. Yeah.
I did. At the time, I thought when I started working at the pregnancy clinic, I really can't relate to a lot of my clients because I had never had a crisis pregnancy and I never had an abortion, and my first kiss was my wedding day.
Yeah. Wow.
So what I found out when I went through this is that who I could relate to were particularly volunteers and staff who had been through an abortion, because they knew what it was like to lose a baby.
Yeah.
They knew what that pain and agony was like. And so that was a surprise for me. One of those, after being involved in the ministry actually for about 10 years by then, that I was getting a new sort of compassion for people.
Sure. So God used David Michael to equip you to minister to those women even more effectively than you could before. Sounds
Absolutely.
Like. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So at what point did you deal with that grief from David, or did it kind of get caught up when you into your new pregnancy and the birth of Bryan?
Yeah. Well, about 5 years after Bryan died, I began to notice, I struggled with depression.
Sure.
And I began to notice that it was rearing its ugly head, and started for the first time really to think about what happened and how was I feeling and how it was affecting my view of God.
Oh, sure.
And it was a good and healthy thing to do, but there's a Bible study that our post-abortive women go through to experience healing. And there's a kind of a companion study for women who lose a child through miscarriage. And I went through that with a friend of mine who walked me through that and started a lot of healing in my life. One of the things that showed me is that how I dealt with that loss and shutting down and not letting people in was not healthy and was not going to get me through life and tragedies that do come as part of life.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's good. That's good to know. All right. So let's kind of shift the conversation now a little bit to your son, Bryan. Help us get to know Bryan a little bit. Take a few minutes and just tell us who Bryan was.
Yeah. Well, I guess the best description I have of Bryan is he's a big hot mess. He was our baby. He was a bundle of joy, a bundle of energy, After having 2 girls, I recognized that there was a difference in little boys and little girls.
Sure.
I think the first words out of his mouth were vroom, vroom. He loved life. He was real little for his age, so we called him Little Man because he was always so much smaller than his friends. People always said, "How are you, 5?" And he'd say, "No, I'm 7." So he loved sports, even though he wasn't real big enough to compete.
Yeah.
He enjoyed singing. He enjoyed hanging out with people. And as he got older, he loved all forms of technology and gaming.
Mm-hmm.
So his ambition in life was to be a gamer. One of my favorite images of Bryan was actually when he asked Jesus into his heart. We had gone up to talk to our children's minister at church, and she was trying to talk to him about the decision that he wanted to make. And there was a bunch of extra chairs in her office, and so he was climbing in and out and over and around the whole time she's talking, and I'm just thinking, sit down and be still. He wasn't. But he would just tracked right along with her. It came time to pray, and he prayed. I'm not sure he ever stopped.
Wow. Yeah.
But it was just that picture of him as all in and all over everything. So.
Yes. Yes. Wow. You shared at the retreat that your family moved when Bryan was 16 and he had to change schools. And you said that he really bloomed at that point. Talk about that.
Yeah. We had always been in a different school district, actually. And when we moved, it meant changing school districts, changing friends, and kind of changing activities too. So he had been in a magnet before, and at this particular school, one of the teachers reached out to him about doing athletic decathlon.
Oh, yeah.
And Bryan was really smart. As a matter of fact, he was so smart that he realized that if homework only accounted for 10% of your grade, there was no point in doing it. Drove me insane. But in this case, it was something that he was smart enough to excel in academic decathlon. And so he plugged in and got involved in that. He was involved in men's choir, and he didn't have a whole lot of friends yet. But he was making friends and kind of making a way. He was always real involved with the youth group at church. And so that's where a lot of his friends were. And then since he did a lot of gaming, he had a kind of a whole community online.
Sure.
But in the process of this, about 4 or 5 months after we moved, first day of Christmas break, we were sitting at home kind of getting ready for the holidays. I was doing some shopping and online and trying to figure out what I wanted to get Bryan in particular that morning. We had plans to have dinner and play games and actually make Christmas cookies for the firemen with some longtime friends with ours that evening. So my husband went shopping to pick up some stuff, and I was sitting on the couch watching a Christmas movie and writing Christmas cards, and Bryan was in the shower. As my husband came home, and he's like, "Where's Bryan? The shower's still running." And I said, "Well, Bryan's still in the shower," and that wasn't that unusual. But after a while, he decided he better check on him. And when he did, we discovered Bryan hung in the shower. We did CPR and called paramedics. And when the paramedics came, they tried to revive him, take him to the hospital. But Bryan was already gone. It was 1 minute of pure joy, and the next minute of, God, what in the world's going on? I had, in the midst of all this, texted a friend, "Pray Bryan." And, 15 minutes later, I texted back, "Bryan's gone." We assumed at the time had killed himself. We later found out that it wasn't a suicide. It was actually what they call autoerotic asphyxiation. So he didn't intend to kill himself. It's a form of the choking game. But mind-boggling to us what was going on and how to deal with all this. By the time we got to the hospital, My pastor and his wife actually beat us there. She's the one I had texted where we were good friends. We were surrounded by friends and family. My girls, one was actually at work. The other one was in the room next to us. And, communication doesn't happen real clearly in the midst of that.
Right.
She didn't realize that her brother was gone. We had not communicated very well to her.
No.
She just knew she was supposed to stay at the house until the policeman left. The other things that I remember was that night when we came back from the hospital, and a lot of people ended up coming to our house. 3 years before, when my daughter Robin had been a senior in high school, one of the other kids in her youth group had committed suicide. And when he did, all the kids in that youth group had gathered in their kitchen. And that night, all the kids were in my kitchen.
Wow.
And it was a sobering thing.
Yes.
I remember being surrounded by people who, food started showing up that night and kept coming for 3 months. It was in the midst of the holidays, and I remember 3 girlfriends kind of moved in for a couple of days and helped us take care of things. I remember my daughter was getting married 3 weeks after Bryan died.
Oh, my goodness. Wow.
And so part of the adventure was, what do we do now? We were still planning a wedding. Do we do this? Do we not do this? And we decided we didn't want to ruin her plans and her joy. One of the new gals at my office was a wedding planner. And
Perfect.
She stepped in and took over and took care of everything. We even had people step up to help us set up for the wedding that I didn't even know.
Wow.
I was going around introducing myself. And I remember people walking us through, okay, this is what you need to do next. This is what you need to do next. Within pretty much a week, it was my birthday. And the next day we buried Bryan.
Wow.
So all the fun adventures that come along with a death in the midst of holidays and all that fun stuff.
Yeah, I can't imagine the way you described it. It was kind of just an idyllic setting that day, getting ready to make Christmas cookies and planning all of the family things and a family game night that night. And then this nightmare just begins. That's so hard for me to imagine.
Yeah, it is. And I know I'm not the only one to go through that.
Yes. You
either get the long drawn out,
right,
or you get the all of a sudden wham, life changes.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't know that one is better than the other or worse than the other. It's just, they're both terrible. Yeah, they're just different. That's right. So what were some of the emotions that you experienced in the immediate aftermath of what happened, and how did you kind of work through those?
I think devastation, emptiness, horror, confusion were some of the things that I had experienced early on. The memories that kind of flood your mind for us, because it happened here at home. I couldn't walk down the hallway without seeing Bryan there, laying there on the floor, or remembering doing CPR on him, which is so much different than doing CPR when you're practicing on a dummy.
Yes.
This is not a dummy.
Right.
It was hard for all of us in that regard. The girls wouldn't go in the bathroom for quite a while. Some of my friends actually came in and redid the bathroom so that it didn't look quite so scary.
Yeah.
So as I was going through a lot of those feelings, one of the things that I did was I decided I'm going to set out on a 1-year plan to get over the death of my son. That sounds kind of funny.
Yeah,
I know.
I get it.
Yeah. So I tried everything I could. First thing I tried was counseling. And I had another friend who was a counselor, and she said, okay, I'm going to recommend a particular type of counseling. It's called EMDR. And I'm going to even recommend a counselor I think you might connect with. So that was really helpful. And that was really good for turning down a lot of those memories that I had and starting to deal with some of those emotions. I decided I needed to build a support group, because one of the things that I did when I lost David and Michael was shut everybody out. So 2 weeks after Bryan died, I reached out to a group of friends, actually about 20 of them, that I trusted. And I said, this is what's going on. I need people in my life. And I would send out every couple of weeks or every month an email saying, this is what's going on. This is what's coming up. This is how you can pray for me.
Wow.
These are some things I've seen God do in the midst of this. Now, some people say, you sent it to 20 people? I don't have 20 friends.
Right. Uh-huh.
I work in full-time ministry. I'm involved in church. I did have a pretty big network, unlike the rest of my family, in particular my husband, who didn't respond like that and didn't have a big network. But I was real grateful for that. Another thing that I did was build some accountability into my life. I told you that I struggled with depression.
Yeah.
And I wanted to be with Jesus. I wanted to be with Bryan.
Sure.
So I reached out to four friends and individually and said, would you meet with me on a consistent basis for a little bit and give me a chance to talk off what's going on in my head and start to process some of this? And so 2 of them were local. We met face to face. 2 of them were out of town, and we met online. And it was extremely helpful in starting to process some of my feelings. And then the kind of the fourth thing on my 1-year plan was I worked through some grief material. When I lost Bryan, I had one friend who had lost a child, and she lived in Chicago. I had met her through a ministry I was involved with called Listen to My Life, which is life mapping. And from the moment Bryan died, almost that very night, I reached out to her and said, help.
Yeah.
How do you bury your child, and how do you plan a funeral, and how do you get up in the morning?
Yeah.
What do you do when you are totally overwhelmed? So in the process of that first year, she would often tell me things that she had learned in the midst of her grief.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, wow, how did you learn all that? And she said, well, she had done, when her son died, they did this grief study at their church. And it was really helpful. She doesn't remember a whole lot because it was early on in the process, but it's something she's continued with. So throughout the grief process, people would say, ask for what you need. So I asked if she would walk me through that material, and she got permission, and she did. She walked me through that material. It was wonderful because it taught me some skills and tools to deal with my grief. And when my body was going out of control, and my mind and my heart, and I didn't know what to do with those thoughts that were ruminating around in my head. It gave me some of those things I needed. Sure.
Well, and good for you for being so proactive. And you probably learned that from your experience with David and Michael.
I did.
Yeah. That's impressive that you actually, made a plan. Now, how did that 1-year thing work out for you? Were you all better after 1 year?
Yeah. One of the things that I often did was get together with other moms who had lost a child. And it wasn't usually somebody I knew. It was a friend introducing me. So I will never forget sitting down for a couple months after Bryan died with another mom from our church who had started a ministry, actually, for kids who had committed suicide. It's called the Grant Halliburton Foundation. And Vanita sat down and she said, okay, well, I'll tell you, the first year was bad. The second year was worse. And the third year was worst of all. Oh, wow. And I looked at her dead-faced and said, I only signed up for 1 year. So
right. Mm-hmm.
The 1 year plan didn't work well, but I'm still on that 1 year plan.
There you go. Yeah.
6 years later.
Right. Yeah. It's a process, isn't it? I mean, it's a lifetime process. We all know that. You mentioned that when Bryan first died, it was considered to be a suicide, but over time you discovered that it was actually something called the choking game or the result of something called the choking game.
Mm-hmm.
How did you all come to know that, and what is the choking game?
Yeah. Well, when the investigators came in and examined the bathroom where Bryan had hung himself, there was something that they saw that triggered to them that this wasn't intentional, that this was probably something that had got out of control. They actually told us almost immediately, within a couple of days, that it was what they term autoerotic asphyxiation. Mm-hmm. So the idea is that you cut off your circulation, and in doing so, it gives you a high.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Typically, kids who might participate in a version of the choking game do this in a group. So if somebody passes out, there's somebody there, and it's a little safer. In this particular situation, if you're alone, you can get yourself in all kinds of trouble, and it can go south before you ever realize what's going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have encountered other parents through the While We're Waiting ministry that have lost children to the choking game. And I think that most people are not aware of that, or that is a thing. So I'm glad that you answered that question, because I think that's important for people to just be aware of, that is something that kids sometimes participate in, and that it can be very dangerous.
Yeah. And I think it's important to, in our particular situation, they knew it before they met with a lot of the youth.
Oh, yeah.
And so they kind of delicately address the whole idea that you got to be careful what you experiment with.
Yes.
And brought up the whole idea of the concept of choking and the dangers involved in that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So thank you for that. Mm-hmm. So as we're recording this episode, like you said, your 1-year plan has now extended to a 6-year plan.
Yeah.
But what advice would you give to a newly bereaved parent, someone who finds themselves at the very beginning of their grief journey?
Yeah. I think the first thing that I would say is let people in. We are not intended to go on this journey alone. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of people who will not understand what you're going through, and that's okay. If it wasn't for those people who didn't really understand what I was going through, I would have been in a heap of trouble. Because out of those inner circle that I let in, only one of them understood what that was like. Part of that is letting people in is some people are going to be helpful and some people aren't.
Right.
So the ones that are helpful and the things that they do that are helpful, embrace it. And the ones that aren't so helpful, let them go. The ones who say stupid stuff, I have taken it upon myself to assume they mean the best.
Right.
They just don't know what they don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And I just view it that way. The second thing I would encourage people to do is to wrestle with God if they need to. It's not unusual to be very angry with God and to, God, I don't understand how this happened. That was definitely part of my journey. And I'm grateful that as I wrestled with God, I didn't try to answer all those questions by myself. I had other people who could speak into that. But God was very gracious in that. He doesn't expect me just to say, okay, well, that's great. If you think about Job, he wrestled with God.
That's right.
If you think about other people in the scripture, David begged God not to take his son. And God honors our hearts, not always in the way we want it to. But wrestling with that is important. And the third thing I would say is lean into people further down the road from you. Mm. I mentioned that I gotten together with a few friends. I got involved with a local group called Hope Dawning and early on, and I would invite some of them to go to lunch with me and hear their stories. And I would ask them what was helpful and what wasn't helpful. Sometimes I'm sure they felt like I was drilling them, but I was really just desiring to hear, how do you do this day by day? And those further down the road are helpful for that. Sometimes that person further down the road may be an author. Mm. Yeah. And so books like Grace Disguised and Colors of Goodbye were both very helpful for me in that.
That's a good one. Colors of Goodbye. Yes, very good. Yeah, well, thank you for that. It's always good to just get some advice. This concludes the first half of my conversation with Julie Thomas. Be sure and come back next week as we talk about the importance of grieving in community, the desire to learn more about heaven, the speed bumps and potholes of grief, and the Rebuild program for grievers. Thanks again for listening, and I look forward to sharing the rest of our chat with you next Wednesday.